opening night is finally here, and it has been a long and amazing road to this moment. I checked my correspondence to see just how long it had been since Elizabeth Easton first presented to me the idea of the IMA participating in the organization of Snapshot. February 23rd, 2007. And actually, I think it seems we have needed every minute of that period to put together this nearly 300-piece puzzle, exploring that first generation of snapshot photography and the artists who embraced it. It's really very hard for me to express how exhilarating it is to see an exhibition come to life, with all the effort, the goodwill, the good luck, the bad luck, and the hard work that they entail. But I know there are people here tonight who get it. For those who work in museums and those who care about museums, you know who you are, it is a pure privilege to witness that special dynamism that comes with putting works of art together and setting the stage for people to experience them. My colleagues at the IMA respond to that special trust, going beyond what is merely required in their approach to their professions. I've decided, and I know I take these things very dramatically, but I really have decided it's like a great orchestra with all the sections coming together for a glorious symphony. I wish I could cite each musician in the IMA orchestra, but at least let me invite every IMA staff member in the audience who has worked on Snapshot to please stand and be acknowledged. Can I have the house lights up? Can I do that? Can you stand up, please? All of you out there. And I can tell you those who are not here, and they're legion, are just too tired to be here. No. I really can't begin to list all the times when I witnessed my colleagues doing what I call above and beyond the call isms. It's happened so frequently for this show, and I cannot thank them enough. Tonight, I also wish to acknowledge the special collaboration of the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. Their founding curator of photography, Françoise Elbrun, shared her matchless expertise in advising us on the exhibition, and the museum has loaned more than 90 works from their collection in Paris. This is the first time that the IMA has collaborated with the Musée d'Orsay in such a significant fashion, and we are very grateful for their generosity. And I think it's fair to say that considering the fragility of these photographs, which of course are works on paper, and our obligation to protect them, I don't think we will see this group of photographs together again anytime soon. So this is an extremely rare opportunity. I would also like to thank a special guest who is with us here tonight from Chicago, and prior to that, from the Netherlands, and that is the Consul General of the Netherlands, based in Chicago, Dr. Hans Heinsbroek, and his family. So please accept our welcome and our thanks for being here. I understand that you are a Bonnard fan, but I also want to remind you that George Brightener, your countryman, is very well represented in this exhibition, and I think will be a great revelation to many in our American audiences. Now, at this moment, I would like to ask my colleagues to join me here on the stage and have a chance to introduce them. Because serving with me on the panel tonight are the three other curators for Snapshot. Now, working that intensely together, and as you've heard, over this long a period of years, could generate resounding shouts of "never again." But in this case, I can honestly say there were not too many cooks in the kitchen. And now I am fortunate to have 3 great colleagues who are also cherished friends. Let me first introduce Elizabeth Easton, on your far left, who is the scholar who conceived and developed this exhibition in the first place. At that time, she was chair of the European Painting and Sculpture Department at the Brooklyn Museum. She is America's leading specialist on the work of Edouard Vuillard, and Elizabeth is now the founding director of the Center for Curatorial Leadership in New York. And the curator who gets the award for traveling the furthest to be here tonight is on your extreme right, Edwin Becker of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. Edwin is the chief curator of exhibitions there, a really challenging post given the activity of the museum's special exhibition program and the great expectations held by the legions of visitors who come to his museum from all over the world. And he had to lead off with the first presentation last fall of Snapshot, where our exhibition premiered. And I would also like to thank the wonderful chief registrar from the Van Gogh Museum, Audrey Koch, down here in front, who is with us this evening and worked with us to round up these loans from really all over the Western world. And next on the stage, in the center, is Eliza Rathbone, chief curator of the Phillips collection in Washington, D.C., where Snapshot was presented this winter and spring. America's first museum of modern art, the Phillips is an institution that is beloved to so many people. Eliza has proven herself a scholar of both late 19th and 20th century art, and she's made it possible for several of the exquisite Bonnards you will see upstairs in the exhibition to travel from their beautiful home in Washington to be with us in Indianapolis. So now off to that competition, right? We'll be, Now the 4 of us are going to divide the honors tonight in presenting a brief introduction to the 7 artists and the basic concepts of the show. Our exhibition begins in the 1880s with George Eastman's invention of the handheld, easy-to-operate Kodak camera. Today, I think it's hard to imagine the novelty and the appeal of these clever new devices. Before that time, photography was largely the province of the professional, requiring bulky tripods, long exposure times, and therefore long poses, and access to all the complexities of developing film. Well, the new Kodak made split-second exposures possible as well, creating the quick snapshot, hence our title, that seemed perfectly suited to the fast pace of modern urban life. Do keep in mind that the process was very different from what we do today. And as this Kodak manual shows you on the right, those photographers didn't have the luxury of looking and seeing exactly what they were framing before they pressed the button. They were instructed to hold the camera at waist length. You looked down into the viewfinder to see what was being framed. So keep that in mind when you look at the exhibition. I think you will see that that certainly made a difference. This simplified camera opened up photography to everyone. And by 1900, France had at least 250,000 amateur photographers. Among them were progressive artists experimenting with the facets of the camera just as they pushed the boundaries of painting and printmaking. And now I'm going to ask Elizabeth Easton to begin our introduction to the Snapshot artists.
Well, I thought I would give you a little bit of history about how the exhibition came into being so much longer ago than 2005. I can't even begin to tell you. When I began my dissertation work on Vuillard, in the early 1980s, I visited the family. And as a young graduate student at the time, it's very hard to find the family of an artist and very challenging when you go into their apartment, where I saw stacked against the wall, facing the wall, 5 paintings deep, all just one group of 5 next to another group of 5. And in all the years I worked with that family, not one single painting did I ever see turned around. And so that just paints the picture of what it's like to be a graduate student there. So I said, well, would it be possible? Do you have sketchbooks? Do you have notebooks, school notebooks? I was writing about Vuillard's pictorial space. Do you have photographs? Because in 1963, 12 Vuillard photographs had been shown in an exhibition in Paris. That is all I knew. And it was called Vuillard et son Kodak, Vuillard and his Kodak. That was all I knew about the photographs. And so Vuillard's great nephew, his heir, Antoine Salomon, threw down on the table 2 manila envelopes. And out of these envelopes, I began to see, I liken it to Aladdin's cave. It was just unbelievable what came out of these envelopes in terms of their interest to me. Things that nobody in the public had ever seen before. They had never been shown, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. But things that resonated so closely with his paintings that I thought this was exciting beyond belief. And I worked with Antoine Salomon for a week until he got a new archivist who arrived, took them out of my hands and said, "You will never see these again." And in fact, that was almost true for 20 years, that I never actually got to work in that archive again. And then I was invited back for one day, and I was shown 2,000 photographs that had been assembled, and then I wrote about them for his retrospective. But that just gives you a picture of what it's like to be a graduate student. I know there's a young PhD student in the audience who works at the museum. Get ready, it's like that. And and sort of what it's like to work with the kinds of materials that are not cataloged, that are not known to the public. And so it was my guess that if Vuillard took photographs with this new invention, other artists might as well. And Ellen alluded to a great curator at the Musée d'Orsay who created their collection of photography, and she did a show on Bonnard. And so I thought, well, if Vuillard and Bonnard took photographs, maybe the other artists in their group and their friends at the time also might have taken photographs. So you can imagine my shock and delight when I found the photograph of Bonnard and Vuillard at a table with the camera. Here, I'm going to stand up so I can. Is this the light? Oop! I didn't mean to do that. I think I turned off the whole thing. We didn't rehearse this beforehand. I pressed that button. Oh, okay. So, and then where's the?
This advances.
No, but where's the red dot thing?
Oh,
okay.
It's a green dot. Sorry.
Technology. Okay. So do you see here is the camera on the table, and they're looking at their photographs. So it's sort of like you have an idea, and then you actually see the thing in reality that manifests the fact that they were at the same place at the same time. This is a photograph on the right of Vuillard holding the camera, taking a picture of Bonnard, who's taking a picture of Vuillard. You know how when you first get a camera, you take a picture of other people taking a picture? And Vuillard's brother-in-law standing next to him on a trip to Venice in front of the Doge's Palace. I could ask for a show of hands how many people have taken this exact picture in Venice. I'm going there in 2 days. I'm sure I'll take the same picture of my husband. And but what's interesting about that, as a little bit of a sideline, I'm a paintings person. I was a curator of paintings. When this photograph was proposed as the cover of our catalog, and when Edwin proposed Snapshot as the title for the exhibition because it worked in Dutch and English, I thought the photographs that resonated with me most were the ones that looked the most like the paintings, and you'll see them throughout the show. But what I learned so many years after working on the show for decades was that there's always a new approach that will teach you something. And the spontaneity of the snapshot was something that I resisted acknowledging and that was really a vivid reality of what these artists also did. And so I think when you go through the show, what you should think about is the way you take pictures and the way they were taking pictures with a new technology that had never existed before. Some of the photographs were very much like the kinds of compositions they sought in paint. And as you see on the right, the great picture from the Phillips collection of Vuillard's mother reading has all the elements of Vuillard that you know from the little jewel of a painting at the Indianapolis Museum. Lots of pattern. Vuillard's full of mystery and evocation. This is a portrait of his mother, but you don't see her face. But you feel her personality and the way she reads the newspaper evoked as much by the pattern of the room as by the fact that if you understand his secret language, you understand that that's his mother. On the left is a photograph of his great patron, Thaddée Natanson, in the foreground, who published the Revue Blanche, a journal that was published in the 1890s to which Vuillard contributed printed matter, and his muse, Misia Natanson, of whom you will see many pictures upstairs. And that evocation of Misia in her interior is as present in the photograph as it is in his many paintings of her. This same kind of thing was sometimes post-dated in photography to the paintings. The painting that you see, which is only in the Indianapolis venue of the show, so the first time we've seen it in the show is our walkthrough this afternoon of the blue sleeve. Let me just translate a little of Vuillard's pictorial vocabulary for you. You see a big figure of his sister in the foreground called the blue sleeve, that's her arm. But it's very difficult, you have to know Vuillard's vocabulary to trace this table back to the figure in the background. This was painted in 1893. In 1905, so more than 10 years later, you see a photograph, a big image of his mother in the foreground, but it takes a while to see the figure of Romain Coulus, his friend, in the background. So you see big elements in the foreground, the lamp, the table, the sleeve, the profile, and then only gradually when you understand his language do you, and here I'm going to show you a detail of that photograph, because only then do you see that in fact Romain Coulus from the background is actually looking at Vuillard as he takes the photograph. You also see in the photographs things that never appear in paint. And you know, when you're looking at 2,000 photographs that are in manila envelopes or in a shoebox, they do not organize themselves, and they do not say, this is how the roll was taken. And so you look and you say, oh my goodness, the molding in this photograph could be the same molding as, maybe that was taken at the same time. Maybe it was the same day. Maybe it was the same moment. Maybe they're all having lunch together. And so this sort of cinematic conversation that was captured where one of the people at the table is talking, another's listening and responding, a third is listening. Where is Vuillard? This is so much the element of his artistic vocabulary. In his mistress's eyes, you see she is looking at him, he's sitting at the table. And that is something in his paintings and his photographs that you'll see. Again, a similar example with Bonnard of this great painting, the Croquet, which alas is too fragile to travel from the Musée d'Orsay, painted in 1892. Look what he's doing almost 10 years later in photography. Exactly the same kind of composition he uses in the black and white of the camera, the patterning of light and dark in nature that he uses with color in the painting. And here, this is a point I think we all wanted to make. There are rare occasions when there's a direct quotation from a photograph to a work of art. And when Bonnard, was commissioned by Vollard to do a huge book of Daphnis and Chloe, he took his lover, then wife, Marthe, into the garden, and he did a series of photographs of her, which you will see up in the galleries. And then he transcribed them almost literally into this great print the prints for the Great Book. This wonderful picture from the Indianapolis Museum of Art was also a sort of transcendent theme in Bonnard's work, where you see him doing drawings all across his career with similar compositional motifs. So our point with the show was not to say photography replaced everything. The artists continued to draw throughout their lives, but and you'll see drawings, you'll see prints, you'll see photographs upstairs. And I believe, oh, this, Maurice Denis, another member of the Nabi group, which was, Nabi meant prophet in Hebrew. They were supposed to be prophets of a new kind of painting. Here you see Maurice Denis, who loved the Italian primitives, as he called them, early Italian painting. And you see photographs of his daughters in a cloister, very tightly arranged, much the way he felt the order of 14th century Italian painting to be, just as he did this, actually when you see it, very small picture of his wife with daughter in a very classical, pictured in a very kind of classical way. And yet these spontaneous views that he took on the beach in Brittany of, again, his child being swung back and forth in the arms of little girls, and a fantastic picture upstairs. But you'll see that spontaneity captured also in painting, and I believe the next picture is for Edwin.
It's for Edwin.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm not going to stand up because otherwise I will diminish the contrast between us. So I'll be sitting. So here is Brightener, and Elizabeth, you mentioned already the one-to-one comparison of photograph and painting, and here you have also one of these examples where you can see that a photograph is taken and then afterwards a painting is being made. Georgeanna Brightener is a Dutchman who was primarily known as a painter. He was very famous at the time, at the beginning of the 20th century, mostly in Holland, but also abroad. And even today he's known as a good photographer, as a very fascinating and inspiring photographer. These photographs were discovered, so to speak, in the 60s of the 20th century. And from that time on, the collections have been broadened, and there is now a huge archive in The Hague, in the Art Historical Research Institute. And they're also on the website if you want to see that, where 3,000 photographs of Brightener are known. And Brightener was quite specific and peculiar in that sense, because he collected these photographs in specific envelopes, making sort of categorizations like Japanese kimono girl, or like this one, or horses seen from the backlight. So he was really using them as a sort of method of helping his paintings to be set up. In this case, he took as a model a 16-year-old girl, which was, well, very difficult to pronounce, I think, in America, Geesje Kwak. I don't know who.
We've been not touching
Not
touching it.
But she was 16-year-old, and she came as a modiniste, as a hat maker from Haarlem, to his studio in Amsterdam. I mean, Brightener was born in Rotterdam, but most of the time he was staying in studios, different studios in Amsterdam. And these series, because it's a series of paintings, were made from 93, 4, 5 onwards, because in 1902, Brightener had seen a huge exhibition in The Hague on Japanese art. And as you could see earlier, and you will notice that also when you compare, for example, this painting of the girl in a red kimono to paintings by Bonnard and also especially Vuillard, you can see that they're playing with patterns, with colors, with contours, with outlines, and especially the contrasts and the patterning of the kimono which Brightener had bought at that exhibition, which you saw in The Hague, and which he dressed up his model with. Beautiful picture from a private collection. And then some nice examples of what Brightener's paintings and also photos are most known of. The city scenes, the cityscapes of mostly Amsterdam. You see a very peculiar example here on the left of a demolition of the Oudezijds Achterburgwal in Amsterdam. painted in 1902, 1903. It's a very daring subject, actually, to paint a demolition of houses and the backdrop, as so to speak, of these canal houses. So not the front, the more picturesque element, but the backside of it. And you can compare that to photographs he took also of houses in demolition. And there's one of these very nice examples of photographs of Brightener, the single, where you can see the perspective leading to a certain point with this silhouette figure, which also is very much reminding of the influence of Japanese prints, Japanese art. This silhouetted figure, which you also see in prints by, for example, Bonnard and Vuillard. So that's also one of the reasons why we included Brightener, not only as a good painter and photographer, but also because there are so many similarities to the work of the other artists in the show, that he really has a place in the exhibition. I think the next one I have to hand over to Eliza.
Okay.
Now we are in Belgium. We jumped from
Yes.
Amsterdam to Brussels,
Right.
and then from Brussels to Paris.
So these two photographs are by Henri Evenepoel, a Belgian artist, not a Nabi, but a Belgian artist who spent his artistic career in Paris, as you can immediately see. We see not only the city that he loved in these photographs, but also the people that he loved, and they became the principal subject of his photography. Evenepoel, and it really is his photography, I think, that recommended him to this exhibition. He's a marvelous painter and a very special case. Most of his work is in Belgian collections, which is why, as far as I know, this exhibition is the most substantial presentation of his work ever presented in the United States. So a lot of people in Washington found it very exciting to discover Evenepoel. Evenepoel had a very short career, but an extremely successful one, given the fact that he only arrived in Paris at the age of 20 in 1892, and he died in Paris in 1899 at the age of 27. It's extraordinary that he made over 800 photographs in 2.5 years. He only acquired his camera in 1897, and he was thrilled by the medium. So in this photograph, we see in these photographs, on the left you see the standing woman is his cousin Louise and her 2 daughters, and then the son that Louise and he had, Charles, is the small boy in the photograph. He presents a fascinating instances of the relationship between photography and painting. He often used photographs to prepare to make a painting, and you will see that in the exhibition, or he would take a photograph that would inspire a painting, as in this case, a photograph of Louise on holiday, a very spontaneous image. She's obviously very happy, and he just captures her smiling at him. And subsequently, inspired, I think, by what she's wearing, this wonderful dress with ruffles and marvelous hat, he paints a fabulous portrait of her, but of course makes a serious portrait. And you see a bit of his tremendous talent in the painting. I think he did Toulouse-Lautrec type scenes, and he was an enormously talented painter. And then also in this exhibition, you see a group of self-portraits, which you see here on the screen. He did many, and it's in this self-portrait that on the lower right that you will see when you enter the exhibition, a really riveting photograph, I think, that shows him this kind of very inquiring way that he went about using the camera, and a creative and inventive way. So when I asked myself, what are these photographs? Are they documents of his life, or are they something more? Or are they studies for paintings, or are they something more? And the answer that I came to was that they were all those things and more. That as a photographer, he created images that were pushed the boundaries and actually went beyond anything that he tried in painting. And we'll never know what he might have done had he had a longer life to lead.
Thank you, Eliza. And now the final two artists in the exhibition. This is Félix Vallotton, another European artist, expatriate, who found his way and his career in Paris. And both this photograph and the painting were executed in 1899, which was a pivotal year for this artist. He first acquired the camera then, and he also, I think, did something he kind of said he would never do. This was an artist who had made quite a life of kind of reaping scorn upon the bourgeoisie, and he created very, very edgy woodcuts that usually dealt with the challenges of men and women getting along. This was pretty basic stuff for him. And in 1899, he married a very well-to-do young widow and kind of embarked on a whole different life, coincidentally the same time that he became familiar with the camera. And I love this pairing where you see on the right this photograph that he has taken of his new wife in one of those sort of dark Victorian rooms, even though this was on the coast of Étretat. And you see how he's changed the image while still taking many cues from the photograph. He's completely changed the tenor of it by adding this irresistible little baby, his wife's niece, in the foreground, doing what babies do with pieces of paper, which is, tear them up and twist them. And all of a sudden, he's given an animation to the image that certainly does not exist in the photograph. But let us never forget that these people are first and foremost artists. And so he's very cleverly kind of edited this composition where, for instance, you have a somewhat competing pattern of fabric in the upper right background of the photograph, which has been all calmed down in the painting so that he can place the emphasis where he chooses. And now to the last artist in the exhibition, a lifelong Parisian named Henri Rivière. And Rivière is the sole artist in the show who was not a painter. His vocation was printmaking. He was really one of the great leaders of the printmaking revival in late 19th century France. And he was a lithographer and also made woodcuts. But he began his career basically in a nightclub, in a cabaret in Montmartre called the Chat Noir, or the Black Cat, which was the big bohemian nightclub of Paris. And one of their special entertainments was called the Théâtre de l'Ombre, or the shadow play. And in the photograph and the print, you can kind of see how that special kind of entertainment functioned. And on the right, oh, I didn't mean to do that. Same thing. Okay, we're even. All right. Okay, there you can see this is essentially the shadow theater being performed, and what happens is there are zinc figures put behind a scrim and a light shining on them from behind so that their profile or their silhouette is projected against the screen and thereby tells the tale. And so here you see a photograph that, and I think this, yes, well, all of his buddies, essentially, backstage at the Chat Noir, they're working in these very tight circumstances to move the zinc figures around to create the story, which is another sign that he was working with a very easy to manipulate camera, or he never could have fitted in that space and taken some of these very dramatic angles. But to me, it was enormously interesting to think that, now I really do want to advance, that this artist who began his career dealing with shadow and light and shadow and contrast and profiles was so attracted to the camera. I mean, it makes certainly a lot of sense. And it also speaks to his great technical ability. He, for instance, was the one artist in the group who seemed to understand enough about the process to work with cyanotypes. And I think on the left, a perfect example of the snapshot, well shot by an artist, where he's captured that quick pace of modern life as these figures are kind of, rushing into a building. She's pulling down her parasol as she enters, but you also have this wonderfully constructed photograph with the natural curves of her dress and her attire contrasting with the strict geometry of the building. And last in the group, I would tell you that you are seeing on your left a view of one of the laborers in the newly constructed Eiffel Tower in Paris from 1889. And through his friends from the cabaret, Rivière was invited to participate in what had to have been the biggest photo op preview ever. It was to see a preview of the Eiffel Tower, which was extremely controversial, and I think he needed some good press. And one of the people invited to go was Henri Rivière. And as he took his camera up this amazing structure, we found that the photographs that he took were not just kind of picturesque tourist views of the city that lay beneath this amazing structure, but he turned his camera to the geometry itself of these amazing steel girders, and then I think also to the drama of the laborers who were making it all possible. He translated many of these photographs into lithographs a few years later. So here is an example, which is not always the case with Rivière's photography, but here is an example where a photograph was a direct inspiration for a lithograph which he created later. It was actually part of a whole suite of prints that he did as a kind of homage to the Eiffel Tower. I will invite you in the gallery where these pieces are compared to see just how the artist and the printmaker in him worked with the seeds of his photograph to, in effect, make a new image. I was knocked out by the stark modernity of these pictures. This is 1889. It's not Roshenko or Kertész in 1929 or 1939. So I thought it was really a fascinating leap ahead to see what these highly inventive artists could do with this wonderful new device called the camera. And now I hope we can have a little bit of a chat back and forth, and we would also be happy to take some questions from or comments from our audience. But I think we've probably covered this, but does anybody just sort of want to summarize the different kinds of relationships that we have in the show in terms of the artist's photograph and whatever work that they're best known for?
Well, I think that what we would like to encourage you not to do when you go upstairs is to try and find the direct relationships between the photographs and the paintings, because though they exist, it's a very small percentage of the thousands. I mean, what you will see upstairs are many photographs, but they are culled from, 15,000 photographs that these artists produced. In that group, there aren't so many that are direct quotes, so don't really spend your time looking for that, though it exists in a small number. What we found compelling, I think, for the most part, as painting people, are the similarities in just compositional inclination. from the artists as painters to the artists as photographers. And as you'll see, when you see the original Kodaks that are upstairs, you don't look through the lens. There's an element of accident that they capitalize on in their use of these cameras. And of course now, when I started thinking about this show, the notion that Kodak would have declared bankruptcy on the very day it opened in Washington was inconceivable, and that we would have iPhones. I mean, in 1981, oh my God, that was so far away. But I think that what the show brackets is the beginning of the era that actually the existence of the exhibition documents the end of, because now we have all of our cameras that are in our telephones, and yet what we do with them is very similar. Now, what is the difference between the kind of picture that we may take and the kinds of pictures that the artists take? I think somebody else can speak to that as well.
Well, it was the same question which came up, what was the amateur photography of the time compared to the sort of artistic view. And you can very clearly see that the photographs were made, though they are a snapshot, with a sort of artistic eye and an artistic conception. So even though it was in a glance, they had the availability and the aptitude to make snapshots which were just artistically very, very interesting. Cropping, overlapping, etc. So there was something in their vision, in their eyes, which made these snapshots different from the sort of general average amateur photographers.
And from each other. I think that's one of the things that you will discover when you go through the exhibition. It's amazing how differently each of these artists use this camera. They're all using something quite similar one to the next. What they photographed what is a reflection of what they observed and what was important to them, both biographically, sometimes it's about their lives and their loves, but also visually. So I discovered, I think one of the charming things about Bonnard, for example, in the exhibition is he takes so many photographs of his sister's children. He never had children himself, but he takes these photographs of the children playing and they're charming, but they also have formal qualities that make you think of his work in other media, like the subject out to the edges, or in one photograph there's a child playing in the distance, and there's just a part of an adult figure cropped in the edge. So how he framed it is something that you will then, of course, see in his paintings and in his prints. So even though the sequence is not always the same, photograph to painting, sometimes the painting, as Buffy said, will precede a photograph, there's this back and forth dynamic between them, and that's what's so exciting and fascinating.
Yeah, I think it really speaks to a kind of visual taste or an affinity of vision that they seek out in this vast world of images that we all confront. Their taste leads them to those things. And I would just say, thinking about, Eliza, what you were saying about Bonnard too, is that I think you also get just a hint of a very droll sense of humor with Bonnard, with these pictures of his niece and nephews, with these little toddlers kind of treading purposefully out of the picture plane. And if you think of many of Bonnard's paintings and prints and screens where he has such an ability to capture, the personality of a haughty cat or a naughty dog or a funny child. And it's not, it's always subtle. I think that's one of the things about many of these artists that's so irresistible, is that subtle grip they have on emotion and humor and sensitivity.
And I think also the novelty is very important, which, for example, with Brightener you see it in his paintings, but also in his photography, because you have to realize that before Brightener, doing all these street scenes in Amsterdam, photographers used to shot these scenes as empty. So there were no people on the streets and on the canal sides, because they wanted just the architecture and just the mood and the atmosphere, but not with people going from the left to the right in front of the camera. And what Brightener actually did was having these people walking through the lens or looking backwards, etc. So it was a completely different approach of making photographs, and also that had an influence, of course.
Sometimes when
on
he
the
was
art.
trailing people through town,
Yeah.
you know, he would turn around.
But I will say one more thing, which is there were, since the invention of the camera in the early part of the 19th century, professional photographers. Artists, I mean, Degas used an old-fashioned camera with glass plates to experiment in photography, as he did with sculpture, with lithography, with a lot of other things. These artists grasped the Kodak when it developed roll film. When it was first invented, you had to send your camera back to Kodak. They would develop the film and they would put a new roll in. Those photographs are round. If you ever see round pictures, those are the early version that were produced by Kodak. In 1895, the Kodak developed roll film, which they would have developers, you know, as we had growing up, down the street, you would take your film there and have it developed. Vuillard's mother would develop the prints in a soup plate in the window of their apartment. But the point is, once this technology was available to the masses, that is when these artists who had experimented with the decorative arts, with lithography, with shadow theater, with so many other things, that's when they seized on this, because it was easy and it was flexible and they could experiment with it. And I think they pushed it in a direction that we didn't see if you look at amateur photographs that you see done at the time by random people. These really do push the boundaries, but a thing to remember is they were never shown ever. So that what you're seeing is something actually that has never been presented to the public in quite this way before. And as Ellen said, that will then go back to the vaults and probably never be seen again in quite this way. But what I think we're hoping is that in future projects with these artists, photography becomes an integral part of a way to understanding an artist's thinking and artistic production.
Well said. Now, we would certainly love to hear from any of you. Howard, I can see you from here.
This was going on in Paris. Were there any other places in the world where artists were using cameras, or was Paris the only place?
Well, Brightener.
Amsterdam.
Well, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Brussels, everywhere.
Yeah.
But you know what?
It
If
was
you
everywhere.
go to the Musée d'Orsay and you talk to any curator where they all do 19th century art, Danish artists, English artists, everybody was using the Kodak. Why did we not include them? It's because maybe their paintings did not resonate with the paintings of the artists we have in this group. Though it's a group of 7 artists, their work is very tightly knit and it overlaps. And so they form a cohesive group, even though that was an interesting thing is, in terms of scholarship, if you only look at the paintings, they don't connect so closely. But when you throw the photographs into the mix, their body of work is really closely connected. But the Kodak, hundreds of thousands of cameras were sold all over the Western world, and but Aitken's photographs do not when I was at the Brooklyn Museum, of course they wanted an American photographer in this group, and it just didn't fit. The uses were not the same.
And I think it's true to say that it could be the beginning. We may find more out about other artists for instance, in European capitals. And certainly in terms of George Eastman and his entrepreneurial spirit, there was an American who was getting those cameras out there. So I think it's possible that there's still work to be done, and we will learn more about it.
Well,
But-
so many of these photographs are still in family attics and shoe boxes, and so I do think it is really a beginning of a whole field of investigation.
Brett?
These are all contact prints, is that right? So the prints are the same size as the negative.
Except for Maurice Denis, who made presentation albums for each of his children. And so he had those blown up professionally, and you'll see it's sort of a visual relief when you get to Maurice Denis because they're bigger. Because what a contact print means is that the photograph is the print of the negative and that size.
Same
and the Bonars are 1.5 by 2 inches. And we had a lot of discussions organizationally in presenting this show about, are we faithful to the original, or do we make some enlargements so that people can see them better? And there was a strict orthodoxy in what was done to not actually do that. Some of the prints are modern prints, printed as silver gelatin prints, as they would have been at the time. Evanpool left no original prints, so that they are modern prints done from the original negatives.
Eliza had to prevail upon the museum in Brussels to actually find those those original negatives so that the prints could be made.
Yeah.
It's true.
Oh, I think it depended on the roll.
You know, the original Kodak had 100.
I was going to say, I think 100.
But the rolls were smaller. And in fact, you know, lecture 2, which you won't hear because it's not scheduled, is what work that I've done actually to try and recreate roll, like what would a roll be? And it's fascinating because we find, I mean, I think we respond to the photographs that are the most artistic and that look like our 21st century view of what these artists are. But when you look at a roll of film, you think, well, what did the artist say, here's my picture? You know, what did the artist go for? And it's really interesting, the more the vocabulary of those roles, but that is for the next generation to research.
And there's that whole sense of sequence. And when you go into the exhibition, you'll see a series that Buffy mentioned by Pierre Bonnard when he was photographing his companion nude in the garden. And as you were saying, there's a kind of cinematic quality to this sequence. And so I've tried to present those in a way that you see a sense of the passage of time and movement. And I was really excited when I read that Bonnard was actually acquainted with the Lumiere brothers, who were the brothers in France at the turn of the century who were doing the very earliest experiments with film and, you know, with the cinema. So, you know, things lead in all kinds of fascinating directions from this show. Any other question before we close? Yes? Oh, yes, we do. Oh, yes, we do. They are not the actual cameras used by the artists, but they are the same cameras that were used, thanks to Edwin and the Van Gogh Museum, who, and actually we have a staff member who went to Goodwill and found one of the little pocket cameras from the 1890s. So they are out there. And
eBay is a good source.
you know, this is a big show. You're going to need to come back several times, don't you think? And now I would invite you to head upstairs for the champagne, the truffles, and there's a lot else beyond that. And of course, the exhibition. And Jane tells me there are 3 ways to get to Pulliam Great Hall. And one, when you come out of the theater, you can take a left and take the main stairway. You can take a right, and there's a small elevator by the side entrance to Nourish Cafe. It's on your left. Or you can take my preferred route for arriving at the exhibition, which is to go all the way back to Ephraimson and up the escalator. But whatever route you take, please get there, and thank you so much for coming tonight.